Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kristin Dziczek, broadcasting live from my house. As many of you are probably listening in the same manner, and this last week or so has really upended our industry, and caused a lot of us to have to move things together on the fly. And this webinar is no different. So we are going to get started here in just a little bit. The audience is coming in. You're welcome to our CARS webinar, second in a series on what's going on with the COVID-19 crisis in the auto industry. And this webinar will be recorded, and it's mostly a webcam webinar. You can check the webcam section of the control panel to make sure you can see the presenters. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty with our guest presenter. John Bozzella will not be able to join us by webcam, but we will be able to hear him. You'll get to see me. And you can submit your questions in the questions section of the control panel on your screen. So that's how the technical details of how this is all going to work. This is what John looks like, if you could see him. We are, in January this year, global automakers and the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers merged to create the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Our guest is John Bozzella. He's the president and CEO of the new organization that's now known colloquially as Auto Innovators. At its founding, Auto Innovators announced a focus on safety technology, reducing emissions, and expanding electrification, which are all things that we're still going to be focused on. But Automotive News quoted John as saying that the industry's innovation strategies require a stable policy framework. I would argue also a stable economic framework, and we're going to talk about that need for stability and more in this webinar. When I asked him to join us a few weeks ago, I thought we'd have a timely discussion about what's going on in Washington, especially with the long overdue fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulations expected to come soon. I also expected we might get a question or two about the COVID-19 and how that might impact supply chains and supply chain disruptions that were beginning to impact our industry back then. But now it seems that we're addressing, really very large economic and policy ramifications of the virus that are more central to this discussion. I got to remember what else is on here. Hold on a second. You guys no doubt know that if you've survived 2008 to 2009, that we did see a dramatic drop-off in sales, 40% drop in the annual sales rate that year. So we're overlaying 2008, 2009 on the first 2019 to 2020, year to date, on where we see China, Europe, and the United States. We're expecting very sharp downward direction in sales as production has essentially halted in Europe and the United States, and production has begun to come back in China. Another framing moment here is that the Center for Automotive Research, you may have seen, we put out a webinar, op-ed piece a couple weeks ago saying that 1 week of lost new vehicle sales was going to result in an estimated loss of about 94,000 jobs, 7.3 billion in personal income, and 2 billion in government tax receipts just for 1 week of lost new vehicle sales. We've since updated that estimate for 1 week of lost new and used vehicle sales and shuttered production, and you can see that the results are much more dramatic. 271,000 lost jobs total in the economy on an annual basis, 20.5 billion in lost total personal income, and $5.6 billion in government tax receipts, that negative government tax receipts. With that as a backdrop, let's get started. So John, it's really nice to have you join us today. Why don't you begin by giving us a little bit of a background of how Auto Innovators came to be and who your membership is.
Well, Kristin, thank you very much for having me here today. It would have been great if we could have done this together, and I apologize that those of you who tuned in to actually see me talk can't see me, but hopefully you can all hear me. Let me start by saying I hope everybody is safe and in good health as we have this discussion. That's what's first and foremost, I think, in all of our minds today, and I just want to make sure that that's true of all of you. Kristin has given a good description of who we are at Auto Innovators. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation was formed on January 1st of this year. It is the result of a merger of two long-standing trade associations, the Auto Alliance and Global Automakers. We came together, the member companies came together over the course of about 8 to 10 months and had a discussion last year about how we could work more effectively together as an industry and really become the unified sole authoritative voice for automotive issues at the intersection of innovation and public policy. And that's what we were able to accomplish. And while we do stand on a strong foundation of two successful predecessor organizations, in many ways we're a startup. We are a new organization with a broader mandate, a much broader membership platform, and a broader focus on innovation. So today we have 37 members that include not only 99% of new vehicle sales in the United States, but include the auto ecosystem and the mobility ecosystem much more broadly. We represent not only OEMs, but suppliers and tech companies and startups and new entrants to the space. And we think that what this does is it allows us to be more effective in our engagements with policymakers and government officials, and certainly more effective in developing public policies that support innovation that really lead to cleaner, safer, and smarter transportation here in the United States. So that's kind of our focus. And that's where we started the year. But of course, Kristin, as you've clearly recognized, and as we can tell, given the fact that we're spending our lives doing webinars now, the world has changed fairly dramatically. And so what's driving us today, and what's been driving us really for the last 2 weeks or so, has been first and foremost the health and safety of our employees and of the employees of our member companies, of our customers, and of the communities in which we are living and working. And so that's really what's driven lots of the actions that you've seen today, temporary suspensions of production to ensure the health and safety of the company's workforces, actions to ensure that dealership repair and service operations stay open so that customers can get recalls completed and can get their vehicles serviced at a point at which personal mobility is really important. And we're working through making sure that as we begin to understand and assess how long this challenge is going to be, that we recognize that auto manufacturing, broadly defined, is critical infrastructure, and that we're critically important not only to supporting public health, but supporting the economy as we work through this. So that's a quick kind of summation of who we are and what we've been up to at this point.
So with your members of about 36, you said 37 companies and growing, including most of the major automakers and many tier 1 suppliers, are there any issues that the Alliance of Auto Innovators do not take into your wheelhouse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we're focused primarily in the innovation space as it relates to energy and environment issues, as it relates to automation, connectivity, motor vehicle safety, and the issues related to the transformation of mobility. We are not deeply focused on international trade issues, especially issues related to bilateral or multilateral trade negotiations or things like that. We will talk broadly and support broad initiatives where there's consensus on a trade or innovation issue related to international relations. But we're really, that is not a core focus that would be probably, Kristin, to answer your question, maybe the one issue that wouldn't be a core focus of Auto Innovators.
Right, and there's another sort of new organization that's out there called Here for America that kind of took those trade issues out for, this was something that the global automakers had started before this merger took place. And of course, there's also the American Automobile Policy Council where the Detroit Three do our members and do work on trade issues. So trade issues are still relevant, and there's still a lot going on there, but that's something that we will only touch lightly on in this webinar. Now to the issue of the day. COVID-19 certainly has started with a potential for massive supply chain disruption. We've now hit a demand cliff here in North America, especially as states and businesses have enacted various levels of social distancing and shelter in place. And we also are dealing with, as John mentioned, a public health crisis. We're in the very early stages of this crisis now. A week ago, we did our estimates of the job losses. Just this week, we're putting out the new estimates of what happens when you shut down production as well. There's certainly going to be a lot of economic fallout from this pandemic. There have been two, and I was trying to check right before we got on here, the third package of COVID legislation that's moving in the last week or so. Can you walk us through, John, what is in those packages for the auto industry and what you're keeping an eye on as the House and the Senate consider the federal government response to this crisis?
Absolutely, and Kristin, I should say to your point about not only the public health crisis but the economic challenges that we're going to be facing. That I'm happy that to be doing having this discussion with the Center for Automotive Research. I think the work you do, understanding the economics and the economic dynamics of our industry is extremely important, and I can't think of a more important time for the work that you're doing than this time. So I hope you and I will both get a chance to talk more throughout the course of the hour about not only what we're doing in Washington and in states around the country to create the right policy environment that we have, but we have an opportunity to highlight the economic work that you're doing, because I think it's first rate. Now, here's what's happening in Washington. First, there was an immediate response, kind of a policy response to COVID-19 that was really kind of an $8 billion, let's call it, public health package that focused on testing and vaccine development and responses that the CDC and other public health authorities felt that Congress needed to provide appropriations and authorization for. And then there was a second package that was larger than that, focused on unemployment insurance and focused on other the beginnings of the economic fallout from COVID-19. What we're dealing with now, and what you see, those of you who are following the debate in Washington, is really now a major package, a package of over $1 trillion, and really, if you count leverage, in other words, the multiplier associated with some of the loan guarantees, it could be many times that, but a massive economic package that's really focused on stabilizing the economy. You know, what's interesting about this crisis, both the public health crisis and the economic crisis, is that we've really not seen this before. You know, I remember 9/11 and our response to 9/11 and the great work that this industry did, the auto industry did across the board to really make sure that Americans had access to personal mobility and could shop. I remember the financial crisis and the challenges that we faced then. Here, what we're doing is the government is effectively shutting the economy down. And so what you're seeing is closure orders and shelter-in-place orders that basically have, as you point out, created a huge demand cliff. And then what you've seen is, as a result of that, and also because of the need to protect the health and safety of our employees, you've seen these temporary suspension orders. And what this is an impossible scenario for the auto industry over a long period of time, to have no revenue and to have payables that need to be honored and made is really a very, very challenging environment to be in for any period of time. And so what we've been focused on is liquidity. The idea that the industry, large players like the automotive manufacturers, the OEMs, as well as medium-sized and small-sized businesses have access to liquidity while we've effectively shut the economy down. Allows us to continue to pay our bills, to continue to support our employees, and be in a position as we get through the peak of the health crisis to be able to ramp back up again. So first and foremost, we're focused on liquidity. And what you see in the packages that are being discussed now, especially the Senate bill that's being negotiated, is a economic stabilization fund that has a combination of loans and loan guarantees and leverage that manufacturers, really of all sizes, would be able to access in order to maintain those to maintain liquidity during this period.
And can you talk a little bit about how quickly that those loans and loan guarantees can get up and running? I know that there are requirements in the legislation that once the Senate bill does pass, and you could give us a little bit of a sense of where you think that stands today. I mean, I know they were sounding like they were pretty close last night and hoping to wrap it up this morning, but I haven't seen it pass yet. How quickly does Treasury have to get their process in place to allow manufacturers and others to access those funds?
Yeah, the bill would require the Treasury to move very quickly. The Secretary of the Treasury to move within a few weeks to have these funds up and running. I should also note that yesterday morning the Federal Reserve announced some extremely strong actions to also support bond markets and to support corporate bonds in particular, among other instruments, to also help support affected industries during this period of time and to create a little bit more economic stability across the board. So a combination of those factors, the Fed doing what it did yesterday, as well as the Senate passing this bill and then the Treasury being required to act within weeks, means that if we can get this bill done today, it's probably a couple of weeks, and then we'll see these liquidity facilities available.
So John, I mean, one of the things you and I have been talking about, and I've been on the phone a lot with folks in Washington and in Wall Street and analysts, is what's different about this downturn. The break-even points, we've been told, are much lower. In the 2008-2009 timeframe, we saw break-evens were 15.5 million units SAR for the automakers to not lose money. And we went well below that with the 40% drop that year. But now they've been telling us they're good at 10 or 12 million SAR. Now, certainly the negative capital operating principle of the automakers means that this is a very, very different situation. That 10 to 12 million break-even point is kind of out the window. Can you talk through a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, well, first, I think your observation is right. I mean, I think that, again, this is different than I remember 2008 and 2009 to be. Before COVID-19, you had industry projections at about 16.8 million units SAR as a projection for 2020, which would have made it maybe the fourth or fifth largest, highest level, in U.S. history. So you had a fairly strong market. You had companies in relatively strong financial positions, and so this is a shock completely from the outside of the industry that the industry has to respond to and deal with. And while it certainly would appear to me as an observer, and I'm not speaking about a particular company or companies, I'm just talking about the industry more broadly, that the industry balance sheets would appear to be much stronger to me now than they were then. That said, when we turn the whole machine off and we say there are no sales for some period of time, which is what's happened effectively, certainly in certain regions, that creates a challenge with a negative working capital model, which is, as a manufacturer, I make money when I sell the car, but I've got and I get that money today, and I've got to make payments down the line. in an environment where sales have stopped, it's never good to have no revenue and still have payables. I mean, you can't operate that way for any long period of time. So again, that's the purpose of the liquidity requests and the economic stabilization funds that you see being discussed by the Senate, and the action I think the Fed is taking rather.
So you and I, you mentioned we both were around through September 11th attacks and the Keep America Rolling days. We're seeing some of those same customer incentives put out, and then of course the 2008-2009 recession. Do you think there's anything in that we learned from those contractions that could be helpful today, or are there any things from the old playbooks that should be dusted off? Again, because they were proven to help our industry in those times. So can you know, what lessons did we learn that could be applied to this wholly new situation we find ourselves in now?
Yes, I would say liquidity is an important lesson. Now it seems obvious, but I do think that the focus on liquidity is critically important. And I have to say that I feel that the administration, as well as both the House and Senate and members of Congress in both parties, recognize that. And so I think maybe that was a good lesson learned, that access to a liquidity with a demand shock of the magnitude that we're seeing is really important. I think, you know, one of the other lessons I think that we learned during both the 9/11 shock as well as the financial crisis is that it's going to be really important that we are ready as an industry to respond as demand begins to come back. The shape of this recovery, so to speak, could look very different than either of the two past recoveries. But we do need to be ready as an industry to respond, which is another reason why I think liquidity is so important, and why we have to make sure that, for example, state and local governments recognize that auto manufacturing is critical infrastructure. This is the Department of Homeland Security's point of view. This is guidance they've issued as recently as this week. And so I think as state and local governments begin to work through their public health responses, that they recognize that transportation manufacturing, broadly defined, everybody on this call, we're critical infrastructure. And so we have to make sure that we're balancing the public health needs of key states and communities with that fact, and that we are ready, government and the private sector, to get back to work as quickly as possible.
So that takes me to one of our audience questions that I'm going to jump to in the middle here. The question as it reads is, so we are determined an essential supplier, and we are continuing operations as we support the end markets and customers designated as essential. It's stressful for our employees as they're very concerned based on the public call to take this seriously. One challenge in keeping them working and focused on our essential role is that the OEMs have actually shut down, despite their purpose would be designated as essential. Are there any insights on OEMs need to balance worker concerns with the broader economic essential operation designation?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a great question, and I think the answer is to some degree built into the question. It's a balancing act, and I think that every company has to make an assessment about how to make sure that their processes as well as their facilities are in a condition that can assure the public health and safety of that company's employees. At the same time, what's happening is state and local governments are taking actions, which is also, you know, in some cases not, you know, as completely aligned with the designation of transportation manufacturing as critical infrastructure or essential. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that there's a balance and alignment. And as companies work through the public health questions associated with their own employees and facilities, that at the same time, state government and local government recognize that we should at some point soon be ready to get back to work broadly as an industry.
So let's talk about back to work. As you know, I work in a forward-looking organization. We are forecasting technologies and vehicle demand and sales and production and employment all the time. It's very rare that we have a serial event like this, where we can see it happening in one part of the country or one part of the world, 2 months ahead of us, another part of the world maybe a month ahead of us, and then happening here in North America. And that's, essentially what we're seeing. So while the public response, the government response, and many other factors of demographics and age and population density may be different in China and Europe, we do get to see a few weeks or months in advance of what is happening with their progress of the disease. So it looks like China might be on the other side of at least this wave of COVID outbreak, and they're starting to return to work. No one knows how long this outbreak is going to affect daily life here in the United States, or when we can start up the factories again. What are you seeing in these global regions that make you think about how we come back online and how we're positioning this industry? This is another audience question, to be among the first to come back online and get started producing vehicles again.
Yeah, so I'm trying to stay as much abreast of what's going on in other regions of the world as I possibly can. I'm not an expert on the public health situation in China, but it does seem that there is a little bit of a return, and at least in some of the announcements I've seen from industry players in China, that they are certainly sort of ahead of where we are, and maybe a little bit over the hump, which is a good sign, because look, we're a global industry, and while we have a tremendous North American based production and supply chain here in the region, we also have global supply chains, and so we're interconnected. So it is important that we understand what's happening there. Again, China does seem to give us a little bit of a bright spot, that about maybe how long this might last, and the fact that if we take the right actions from a public health perspective, that we should be able to get back up and running in a fairly reasonable time. But we just don't know that, and there could be differences between here and how we're reacting and there. But the most important thing I think we can do in terms of, to the question, what can we do to get back up and running quickly here, is I think a couple of things. The companies are clearly doing what they need to do to make sure that they are ensuring the the health and safety of their workforces in the communities in which they're operating and their customers. So that has to be first. And I think you're seeing those actions taking place. After that, we just need to get alignment between the federal government's guidance about transportation manufacturing being critical infrastructure, and the work we're doing is essential, and the state and local orders about what needs to remain closed and what needs to be reopened. I don't think we have to choose between public health and the economy. I think we can do both together. And that's the work we need to do, is making sure that the governments are aligned, federal, state, and local.
Are there any states that stand out to you as putting forth really compelling case for addressing both the public health and the economic crisis that we're in right now?
I think in some ways it's still a little too early to tell, because I think really the focus seems to be first and foremost on the public health aspect of it. I'm hopeful that in states where there's a strong manufacturing presence and a strong industry presence, that we will see that balance work itself out first. Look, states like Michigan and Alabama and South Carolina, and all across the country, where they are. Those states know what we mean to their communities and to the economies there. And I think that's where we have to focus our efforts, is to make sure we get the balance right in the key manufacturing states first. I will say also that without demand and without access to markets, one might ask the question, well, why are you building cars and trucks if you don't really have access to selling them? And so we're working very closely with the dealer organizations and like the National Automobile Dealer Association to make sure that we have a plan for the retail side as well.
That's great. One of the things that we're wondering is, what do you see coming? I mean, we're now looking at Congress working on the third package of legislation. What do you see coming for future legislative packages? CAR's CEO and President Carla Bailo and I published an op-ed in The Hill. I don't know, it seems like an eon ago, but it may have been last week. We had in there things that we need to consider down the road, like support for consumer incentives or support to continue essential R&D that maintains the United States' competitive position in the longer run. What do you think about future legislative packages, the possibility of getting consumers back into the showrooms with vehicle purchase incentives from the federal side? And is there anything you're hearing about the consumer side of demand having any support? And then we'll take innovation as the second question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Our focus has been on liquidity and on support for the economy broadly, and that's really what's in this third measure that's being debated and discussed right now. That's been our focus because it really is absolutely critical at this point. Down the line, I think whether there's a fourth stimulus package really will depend on a number of factors. One, how long the closure orders go. How long are we going to keep the economy effectively shut down, as well as how deeply the effects are felt across the economy broadly. So I think without knowing that, it's hard to guess. I do think that there will be some discussion about infrastructure, and in an infrastructure type package. While I'm not predicting success for an infrastructure package, you could see how that might be a place where discussions about transportation infrastructure and the demand side might play itself out. But I think what Congress is trying to do and what the administration is trying to do right now is to do everything it possibly can in this third package. And I think that's where our focus is, and that is where Congress's focus and the administration's focus is.
So can you take that then to companies that are going to be in a cash crunch in this shorter period of time, what the implications are for those critical research, development, and engineering tasks that are ahead of us? I mean, certainly this is an industry that has been challenged to meet aggressive fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulatory targets around the world. We don't yet know what the regulatory targets will be in the United States. And so, whether those policy or regulatory actions might get delayed by this COVID crisis. Can you talk first about the continuation of R&D and engineering funding when we're in the midst of an economic crisis? It looks to me like some of those things get pushed out and delayed, and that could have implications for the United States' competitive position. And then secondly, can you address the pending docket on policy and regulatory actions that are coming at the auto industry, and is there any relief from that? What do you think is coming?
Yeah, the innovation is critical, no question about it. We're going to have to continue to invest in the transformation that this industry is driving, whether it's in low carbon and electric drive propulsion systems, whether it's in ADAS systems, advanced driver assist systems, and ultimately self-driving systems, whether it's in connectivity, vehicle-to-vehicle communications, advanced telematics. All of that work needs to continue. And the reason it needs to continue is because that's what gets us cleaner, safer, smarter transportation. This is where our interests align with policymakers. And this is where the opportunity is for success in this industry going forward. And it's also where our opportunity for global leadership is as an industry. And so we can't now step back from those initiatives and take our eyes off the ball there. That is a challenge, and it's a challenge, especially in an environment where we've effectively shut the economy down, and where there'll be economic challenges as a result. But we need to continue to do that. I don't expect that the regulatory time frames that we're operating on now will change dramatically as a result of this. If we look at the docket, as you call it, we do expect to see the second phase of the fuel economy and greenhouse gas federal rule out shortly, probably by the end of this month or early April. That would set the actual standards for fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for model years 21 through 26 at the federal level. I think we still expect to see that in as I said, the early April timeframe. Work that's being done with regard to automated vehicle updating rules is continuing to work at NHTSA, although I will say that the ability for Congress to create a national framework for highly automated vehicles is maybe a little bit further on the back burner that we might have hoped a month or so ago. So there's still plenty of work being done, and I don't expect that nor should we, I think, expect that the regulators are going to immediately put their work aside. So we're going to have to balance those regulatory realities with the work we're doing to respond to COVID-19.
Well, and I think, one of the things that's the Center for Automotive Research is looking into is, how does the consumer react to, the onslaught of electric and electrified vehicles that the automakers have planned to come out for the next couple of years. We have historic low prices of both crude oil and gasoline. We were looking this morning, it's, going back to 1948. We haven't had real gas prices and oil prices at this low of a level. And some of the forecasters in crude oil pricing see it doing nothing but going further down. I mean, the demand has fallen off. My car has sat in the driveway for 2 weeks. I'm not buying any gasoline. So, that really does challenge the economics and the return on investment for a consumer purchase of an electrified vehicle in this, recovery period that we're going to hopefully see soon. Do you have any comments about how the aggressive electrification plans play out in a economy that's struggling, in a place where fuel prices are so low and the ROI is so hard to get over?
Yeah, you make a great point. It is extraordinary what's happening in the crude oil market, as well as in what's happening to the price of gasoline at the pump. It is dramatically lower than we could have imagined a month ago, and certainly it does change the economics of electric drive vehicles. There's no question about that. We have to look at this in the short term, but also in the long term. We do, as an industry, need to continue to make progress to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from cars and light trucks. We do need to do that in a way that supports innovation. And I do think that there are tools in the regulatory toolbox, so to speak, that regulators could employ to ensure support for the innovation that is required now to be ready when the market is more accepting, quote unquote, or ready for electric drive vehicles, when there's more free demand for them. That's the challenge we face right now. 2% of the market is electric drive vehicles across the country. I can't imagine that number is going to grow dramatically over the balance of this year. So you're right, the economics, there's a disconnect right now. And so what we're hoping is that as we go through this process, there's room in the regulation to allow companies to do that innovation, and for the regulation to support that innovation even when they're ahead of the market.
And then, another thing that's coming at us this year, and I know that trade is sort of outside of your wheelhouse at your new organization, but I think we can talk a little bit about the passage of the USMCA. So it has now been ratified in all 3 countries, and we're looking for the uniform regulations to come out. The administration seems very set on a July 1st enter into force date. And, this is another thing that Carla and I addressed, but I think you can talk about it too, about an aggressive enter into force date for the USMCA and how that challenges an industry that's going to be otherwise challenged to get back to work when we get on the other side of this.
Yeah, we have suggested that the administration consider a delay in the entry into force of USMCA. And, let's step back. I think and recognize what was accomplished with it through the negotiation of USMCA. The new automotive rules, I believe, will result in more investment in the region and in the United States, more automotive investment, which is good for the business and it's good for American auto workers. We think and are hopeful that the balance is right between creating more investment and also maintaining a competitive auto manufacturing platform in this region to be able to compete favorably against other global manufacturing platforms. So I think that's good. This question now about when the agreement enters into force is simply an opportunity to give manufacturers, suppliers, the industry broadly, a little bit more flexibility as they are transitioning into this new set of rules. It is certainly not a suggestion or a request that we go away from the goals that we set in the renegotiation of NAFTA and the creation of USMCA. I think those goals are set. This is purely an opportunity to give the companies some flexibility and some breathing room as they transition to these new rules while at the same time addressing the COVID-19 crisis.
Exactly, and I think the regulatory process is usually about 90 days. This is cutting it a little bit close, so there's even some talk that they would start with a July 1st entry into force with provisional rules, but that would be modified later, and that I think is just really challenging for this industry to take on in a hopefully on the other side of the emergency that we're in right now.
Yeah, and if I would just, just to connect your two last questions, I think flexibility is an important word given the crisis that we're facing. So as we're looking at USMCA, as we're looking at how to make sure that we have alignment, for example, between the federal greenhouse gas and fuel economy rule that's coming out and the work that the states are doing, I think what we want to do is create an opportunity in an environment where government and industry are working together, recognizing that we've got to get through the crisis, but that we have to continue to make progress toward our goals. And I think that does require on all sides, from a government perspective, as well as from an industry perspective, a willingness to recognize the crisis, to recognize the centrality of this industry to the economics of our country, and that we've got to make sure that we're flexible in how we're dealing with these regulatory, the regulatory guideposts while we're working through the crisis.
Well, and certainly we've seen some flexibility in the regulatory frameworks in Washington as I'm going to shift focus a little bit to what the auto industry is doing to respond and help our healthcare and medical device and personal protective equipment crisis that we're facing now. So there was a little bit of flexibility provided that N95 masks for industrial use could be used in healthcare settings, and we've seen some automakers and suppliers donating their stash of N95 masks for use in healthcare. We're also, seeing GM and Ford and some other large companies come to the aid of the medical device manufacturers and try to expand their capabilities. I mean, not that I think that an auto plant is going to start making ventilators, but Ford has detailed some of the things that they're doing, and GM has got a partnership with some medical device manufacturers as well. And we're seeing, bringing to bear the strength of the auto industry's supply chain and logistics optimization. You need something from here and you need it now. The auto industry's scale is just so much larger than these smaller industries that are struggling to keep up with the medical needs. We're also hearing, and some of our affiliates have asked about this earlier in the last couple of days, about the Defense Production Act. So we do have automakers and suppliers rising to that challenge. So what is the outlook for, the president's use of the Defense Production Act, which would allow the federal government to get more involved in who's producing what for what needs?
Yeah. By the way, I'm glad you framed the question that way. It is very, very gratifying to see the industry step up to this challenge. And I'm not surprised, as a longtime veteran of this industry, to see companies taking a leadership position to bring their engineering prowess and their logistics capabilities and their scope and scale and their problem-solving abilities to this challenge is really gratifying. And I think those of us who are in industry should feel good about that. That said, we have to deliver and get it done and help move forward. So, but it's really great to see. The Defense Production Act, the president did issue an executive order. I think it was about last week, Thursday or Friday, Wednesday or Thursday, that basically invoked the Defense Production Act. And basically what that means is that the Department of the Health and Human Services has the ability to work with industry to make allocations and to make requests to address the public health challenge and to get materials and equipment necessary. There's been some debate about whether the president's actually doing anything under the act. I'm not going to wade into that. The president clearly issued an executive order. Companies are doing things, which I think is great. We'll have to see how things develop over time. I think it is an opportunity for companies that believe they can help to help. I don't, what I seem to be observing, and again, I don't have any inside information about what the companies you mentioned, what drove their decisions, but they're great decisions. And I don't think companies that want to do something have to wait to be told under the Defense Production Act to do something. I think they can reach out. And in fact, we're happy at Auto Innovators to help make those connections. If there is a company involved in this webinar that has a thought or wants to participate, we're happy to make a contact through FEMA to help you do that. So I think, we'll just have to see, how long and how deep the public health challenge runs through the country before we can really understand exactly to what extent the president will utilize the authority under the executive order pursuant to the Defense Production Act. But it is there, and we are seeing governors who are requesting the president to take more action under the Defense Production Act. But again, just to finish that thought, I think clearly you see companies in this industry aren't waiting to be told under the act to do something. They're stepping in.
Well, and we're seeing, you know, a very different sort of response to in Canada. Canada, of course, has a national healthcare system, so they know what their healthcare needs are. The government of Canada has put out a procurement list. The Association of Parts Manufacturers in Canada, APMA, is marshaling the resources of their members to try to respond to those needs in Canada. And similarly, here in the United States, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association, together with CAR, the state of Michigan, the Detroit Regional Chamber, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, and a number of other partners are working on how to coordinate that response among auto manufacturers in this geographic region. So I'm not going to say it's our next webinar because we're scheduling several out, but I will have information at the end of this webinar about an upcoming webinar where we're going to talk in more detail about that response from auto to supporting the manufacturer of medical devices, personal protective equipment, and other things that the healthcare system is in short supply of right now, and how automakers and manufacturers are responding, and more about what you can do to help. We have some information on our website about that as well at cargroup.org, and I'll put that up again too. But I wanted, as long as we're on this topic, I'm going to talk about an upcoming webinar. It's scheduled for April 2nd, and our CEO, Carla Bela, will be leading that one. I'm going to take a couple of the questions that have come in and kind of go through those. Let's see. Can you comment on how you see the government liquidity assistance being provided to auto stakeholders? So I think this is a question about, is there any set-asides or priority, and will the autos get any special attention? As it seems, you know, 2008 and 2009, we were kind of disproportionately impacted in that downturn, and this downturn has been a leveler, a level set across many industries. Is there any prioritization for funding amongst the tiers of the auto sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. The way the legislation is developing is that there's a big kind of loan facility.
The 425 billion, yeah.
Yeah, there's 500, and so there's some that's specifically allocated for airlines, and then and for air cargo. And so when you move that out, where they're specifically there's a specific allocation for them, there's 425 billion that's left for affected industries in general. That's how the legislation's read. It is fairly clear to me, again, having been through 2008 and 2009, and also in my conversations on Capitol Hill and with the administration, that there is definitely a focus on the auto sector. No question about it. I think some of you probably heard the president say something to that effect at a recent news conference, and on a call in response to Governor Whitmer's question. So I think there is definitely a focus on the sector. In terms of what the actual prioritization is and the use of the facilities would be is really going to be up to individual companies working with the Treasury and with the Fed. So I think the good news is that you have facilities and that they have leverage and reach and a multiplier associated with them. And now it's going to be a matter of individual companies working with the Treasury and the Fed as needed.
So we have a question for us on whether CAR is going to update our forecast for US sales, and what's our estimate for 2020 now. We are working on that. If you are on this call and you are an affiliate member of the Center for Automotive Research or an Automotive Communities Partnership member, you should be getting that information to you through the member portals. If you're not a member and would like to become a member, we can talk to you about that, certainly, but we're still crunching through those numbers and trying to come up with a range of scenarios based on the amount of time the industry may be shut down and what the the contours of these federal assistance packages and loan guarantees look like, because those sharply determine what the sales will be, or what our sales forecasts will look like in response to this crisis. There's a question about, are there automakers still operating in the US, Canada, or Mexico? I think there's a handful of plants, 2 or 3. John, do you happen to remember if there's, which plants are still open?
The last numbers I looked at, there were, out of 44 manufacturing facilities for the for the OEMs
in the US.
In the US, two were open and 42 were closed. In Canada, I think everything is down, and Mexico, there's a little bit of production open. I think the region as a whole is operating with 87% of capacity down this week.
Right. Another question is, are companies keeping orders for parts open and active so that when the suppliers come back online, they know what they need to produce and they have their supply chains producing when they're ready? This person would hate to see the OEMs having to hold production waiting for parts when we try to flip the switch back on.
Yeah, boy, that's such a great question. Obviously, the specific answering that question specifically as it relates to a specific supplier or a specific component supporting a specific manufacturer vehicle, I can't answer. But we are focused on that challenge generally. And this is one of the most important reasons why we're working with Department of Homeland Security to make sure that there's a recognition up and down government that this is critical infrastructure and that we're essential. We certainly don't want a situation where there's a region where one supplier operates, where that supplier can operate, and that would affect auto production among a number of different producers, or vice versa. So I think not only is it about how the companies are operating with regard to their order bank, so to speak, but it's also, we have an obligation, those of us who are engaged with the policymakers, to make sure that government could unintendedly interfere with that flow of components to auto manufacturing unintentionally as we start to ramp up. So we're mindful of that.
Well, and I think another concern there, for me at least, is looking at what's happening in other regions. I mean, Europe is being hit very hard right now. We may not have already seen the supply chain, the full brunt of the supply chain disruption coming out of China, just due to the time on the water and the inventory banks that we keep of parts that come across the Pacific Ocean. Similarly, it's time on the water and inventory banks of parts from Europe. And if Europe is down longer or down deeper, there are manufacturers here who depend on big componentry, engines and transmissions, as well as parts that coming out of Europe. So we could see some struggle to get back to full production, depending on what's happening in other regions of the world as this disease takes its course.
I would agree.
One of the things that is also a concern here is, the disease is taking its course among people who live and breathe with shaking everyone's hands and being around each other, the members of Congress. Over the weekend, we learned that Kentucky Senator Rand Paul was diagnosed with COVID-19. There's been other senators and members of Congress who have been exposed and are in isolation, and they've therefore been missing some of these votes. Do you think the congressional leaders will enable remote voting for senators and members who are personally impacted by this virus? And how do you think the less than full strength congressional dynamics play out? Does this lead to more bipartisanship? Maybe.
I think it does. I'll answer the last question first. I think it does for two reasons. One, the crisis is so enormous. What I'm seeing is it coming together, both houses, both parties, with the administration to get something done. I'm not a constitutional scholar as it relates to whether Congress can vote remotely. What I think is going to happen, certainly with this third stimulus tranche, is that since the Senate is in, they will negotiate. Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats get a package. The House Speaker and House Minority Leader are involved in those negotiations. So my sense about how this will play out is that the Senate will come to an agreement, pass a bill, and the House will pass it as Speaker Pelosi said this morning in a public appearance, hopefully by unanimous consent. And so that would allow the House to act at less than full strength with no objections.
Great. So John, we're running up to the top of the hour here. I want to make sure to be conscious of everyone's time and your time to get on the next Zoom or GoTo meeting that you're going to do at 2 o'clock. How can our webinar participants follow you and stay connected to what auto innovators are doing in Washington and in states across the country?
Well, thanks for that, Kristin, and thanks for having me on. We're open and we're growing, and we're anxious to do what we can to be helpful to the industry broadly. So reach out if you're interested in membership, or reach out if you're interested in the work we're doing. And you can find us at autosinnovate.org. And you can reach me at Bozzella, JBOZZELLA at autosinnovate.org. We're happy to help. You can follow us on the typical social channels, and we look forward to working with you as an industry through this challenge and back to full strength.
And I would like to mention from the Center for Automotive Research, the recording of this webinar will be available on our homepage later today. So if you want to share that link with others who you wanted to have listened to what we had to say, it'll be on our website at cargroup.org. There's a lot of other information related to the COVID-19 crisis there, as well as information for our next upcoming webinar on the arsenal of health, how automakers and suppliers are stepping up to support the medical response to COVID-19 crisis. That's Thursday, April 2nd. From 1 to 2 p.m. We are also working on developing a webinar around the capital needs and talking with some folks, some really smart Wall Street analysts and people like that, to talk about how the whole capital play out works once we know a little bit more about how the Treasury loan facility is going to be operationalized as well. And finally, I'd like to note that the Center for Automotive Research, we appreciate your engagement. We appreciate your participation in this webinar. We're a little dinky 25-person nonprofit organization. If you like the work we're doing, please join us at cargroup.org. If you can't join us as an affiliate member or an ACP member, you can use the cargroup.org donate now web button and help support this service to the industry that we're trying to keep everyone involved and on board on where we're going in the middle of this crisis. So we hope it's helpful to you, and we want to thank everyone for joining us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.